Joining us now, best-selling author, acclaimed war correspondent Sebastian Junger. He is out with a new book titled Freedom. Sebastian, good morning. It's great to see you. I want to do a deep dive into your book in just a moment, but as someone who has covered the war in Afghanistan so closely, been going to Afghanistan for 25 years, I think it is. What's your reaction to America, after nearly 20 years of war, pulling up and leaving? What will that country look like based on what you know once the United States leaves?
Well, I can't see into the future, unfortunately, but I can talk about the risks, I think. Of course, without the U.S. there, we're pulling out a very small number of troops, 2,500, I believe. There's 40,000 cops in New York City, so that gives you a sort of perspective on the size. But that was enough to sort of keep the country more or less glued together, protect the government. Without those troops there, clearly the Taliban are at risk of taking the entire country and imposing their own style of regime on the Afghan people. The Taliban are very, very sophisticated thinkers. They're deep strategic thinkers, or they couldn't have fought us to a standstill for 20 years. So I'm not sure they're necessarily going to impose this really harsh Islamic kind of society that they're infamous for, because they don't want blowback. They don't want to revisit this story with the United States. So they may be more shrewd than that, but clearly the price for this withdrawal will initially be paid by the Afghan people by suppression. Eventually, maybe Al-Qaeda will take root again in Afghanistan, but again, the Taliban may not make that mistake twice. They don't want to go through this again, so who knows?
Yeah, we had the school bombing, a terrible school bombing that killed at least 85 people a couple of weeks ago there. Perhaps a message being sent, but you are as plugged into the veterans community as anybody in this country, Sebastian. What is the feeling among the men and women you know who for 20 years put their lives on the line? Many of them have given their lives for the cause there.
Yeah. You know, interestingly, I think it's been long enough for most of those guys that I mean, I say guys because I was in a unit that was all male, so that's by association. Yeah. Obviously, many women served there. But I think it's been long enough. I was there in 07, 08. The bulk of the majority of our force was there a few years after that with the surge. I think it's been long enough that there actually isn't a huge amount of conversation about it. I remember when they pulled out of the Korengal Valley, there was a huge conversation. It was a very iconic, sort of symbolic place. But then, as some veterans pointed out, like, wars end, outposts get dismantled. Like, that's just what happens in every war, and we shouldn't expect anything different of this one.
Sebastian, there was some talk amongst military commanders that if only U.S. forces had had a few more years, 3 to 5 more years, then they could have really shored up the Afghan forces to resist an eventual possible Taliban takeover of the country. Do you buy into the argument that after 2 decades of fighting, another 2 or 3 years really would have made any difference to the country?
Personally, I don't buy into that. I think the main reason the Afghan forces cannot defend themselves, they're the same people. They're just as courageous, just as good fighters as the Taliban. But they're dependent on a government for their ammunition, for their air supply, for reinforcements, a government and a military that is riddled with corruption. And the U.S. never really tackled the corruption in that country. We went in with a light footprint after 2001, 15,000 troops. That's almost nothing. Light footprint and a ton of money that we threw around. The money made the corruption even worse. And of course, back in 1996, when I was there, as the Taliban were taking over, what I was told by many Afghans is that they were letting the Taliban in, even though they hated them. They were letting the Taliban in because the Taliban were better than the corruption that the Afghan society was living with. So, you know, the U.S. did not address the main grievance that the Afghan people had, that the Taliban were offering a solution to. And another few years of fighting isn't going to help if we don't address that core issue.
Your book, War, documentary film Restrepo, must read, must watch to understand what's happened there over the years. Let's talk about your latest book, Freedom, Sebastian. It's fascinating because you really, you touch on so many different moments of freedom over, 5,000 years or something like that. And it starts with this incredible trek that I'd love to hear you talk more about, 400 miles, I think it was, where you and a couple of other guys just started walking from Washington up to Philly, then turned west into the Allegheny Mountains. All told, it was 400 miles. Why did you do that, and what did you learn on the trek?
Yeah, we thank you. Yeah, we called it high-speed vagrancy. We were walking along the railroad lines. We were moving 10, 15, 20 miles a day. We were, it's completely illegal out there. There aren't a lot of cops out there unless they're actually looking for you, which sometimes they were looking for us, once with a helicopter, but we always managed to avoid them. It's the rail lines are these swaths of no man's land that just crisscross America, and you could sort of do what you want, right? We were drinking out of creeks and sleeping under bridges and abandoned buildings, and it's not the wilderness where you're supposed to hike. It's this weird mix of urban and farm and woods and suburbs. It's a mix of everything. You have to hide from the trains because the engineers will call you in. We got very, very good at moving sort of tactically. I mean, by that I mean staying out of sight, taking care of ourselves, making sure our security was okay. We had one machete to defend ourselves if it came to that. It never did, obviously. And I realized at the end of this that we'd all been in a lot of combat, and the sort of close fraternity of a small group in tough circumstances felt very familiar and very, very good. And what I realized later is that over 400 miles, most nights, we were the only people in the world who knew where we were, right? And that's one definition of freedom. And so I go on from there to talk about how humans, for tens of thousands of years, one of their core values is freedom. It's defending their community and their children and freedom. And it's one of the few things that people will die for. And so I write about how humans maintain their freedom. There's three basic techniques. You can run away from your oppressor, you can defeat him in battle, or you can outthink him. And so my book's divided into run, fight, and think.
Sebastian, as you know, in the news just even today, there's been such a bastardization of the term of freedom in some quarters about what it means to be free. I'm not going to wear a mask because of my freedom. I'm not going to get the vaccine because of my freedom. Those are just recent examples. What does freedom mean to you? How do you see the word freedom? Obviously, it means different things to different people, but what is freedom to you?
Yeah, it's like I'm not going to stop at red lights because of my freedom. I mean, you can,
right.
you phrase it differently, and it shows you how absurd it is. People, when they say the word freedom in terms of this society, they're really talking about their rights. It's not freedom. They're talking about their rights within our society. And those rights are decided upon by the group. You may disagree. You can move to Somalia if you don't want people to telling you what to do. Essentially, what you have the right to is to be free from oppression. You don't have the right to be free from obligation. If you live in a society, you have to accommodate its rules and its norms, like driving on the right-hand side of the road and stopping at red lights, and sometimes wearing a mask. I mean, the government might be wrong. You might disagree. There's avenues for recourse. You can go to the courts. You can go to the ballot box. But as long as you're benefiting from this society, you kind of have to play along with its rules. And that's been true since humans were living in groups of 30 or 40 people in our prehistory. I mean, and it's still true in a nation of 330 million. It doesn't really change that basic relationship between the individual and the group.
Sebastian, Michael Steele's here with a question for you. Michael?
Yeah. Hey, Sebastian. Man, I love where you're going with this book and this concept. But here's the rub. The reality of it is, particularly picking up on your last point, that, we can, there's a difference between being free from oppression versus being, free of obligations. What do we do and how do we respond? And what was your experience in the journey you took to understand that distinction? And why are so many of us getting it wrong? Why are so many of us distorting that very fine line between being free from an oppressor to the point that we ourselves, in promoting that, become oppressors?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's an eternal debate between conservatives and liberals. Where does the government's authority end in terms of what it can tell you to do, right? And I would say the conservatives are, they err on the side of the government doesn't have any right to tell you what to do. And liberals, I think, err in the opposite direction. It's a sort of nanny state that can frankly be annoying to everybody. So